Good afternoon. I don't know if I turned the phone off. But this is not going to be long because guess who's going flying at 5 o'clock? And it's 4 o'clock. Not to rush. This is short and simple. And if you want to hear the extended version, I'm going to be preaching it at Mount Lebanon this Sunday at 11 a.m. And what are we talking about? We're talking about, are you familiar with that demonic spirit inside of you? And until we recognize and realize that there's always the enemy that is constantly after those who have chosen to follow God, will we be prepared to deal with that? Especially that particular enemy that dwells inside of that little mind of yours, that little mind of ours. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Talking about that demonic spirit and that demon-possessed man that Jesus came upon in Garson. So let's start here. Hey, we're in chapter 5. So 5 chapters already from what? 18 months ago when we started this ministry? And so this is a great place to be because now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty. We're about halfway through the book of Mark. And so it says here, a third of the way through the book of Mark, a demon-possessed man is healed. Chapter 5, we're going to be reading. Now the story itself actually goes from the first verse to the 20th verse. We're going to cut it off at 12, verse 12, because we just kind of want to focus on just getting the understanding of how the mind can be attacked. And today we're dealing with a lot of mental health challenges. That's what we've called it out to be. A lot of churches are in fact here. Okay, so here we are. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. Then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of Gadarian. And when he had come out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs. And no one could bind him, not even with chains, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains. And the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken into pieces. Neither could anyone tame this guy. And always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. Very weird. When he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshipped him. And he cried out with a loud voice and said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of Most High God? I implore you by God that you do not torment me." For he said to him, "Come out of the man, unclean spirit." Then he asked him, "What is your name?" And he answered, saying, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Also he begged him earnestly that he would not send them out into the country. Now a large herd of swine was feeding there near the mountains. So all of the demons begged him, saying, "Send us into the swine, that we may enter into them." And at once Jesus gave them permission. Then the unclean spirits with an S, went out and entered the swine. There were about 2,000. And the herd ran violently down the steep place and into the sea and drowned in the sea. And so they ran violently down the steep hill into the sea and drowned in the sea. We're going to stop there at 14. There's a lot going on here. If you're not already somewhat familiar with it, and a lot of us are familiar with the story, and sometimes in that familiarity, we tend to overlook some very common, gentle points that need to be made. And so that's what we're going to focus on. And once we get beyond 12, you start thinking about another factor in the story, which we will go over in 2 weeks. But right now, I want to just kind of focus. I'm going to have to read back through certain parts of it so that you get what's really trying to be portrayed here. Now remember, this comes off of the hills, if you remember 2 weeks ago, when Jesus and the disciples had gotten onto the boat to go onto the other side of the sea. And what happened? The storm arose at the time that Jesus was sleeping. And so remember 2 weeks ago, we talked about the fact if we just dismiss this as a miracle of Jesus calming the sea, then we'll miss the real point. The real point is that when Jesus is in your presence, you can be in the midst of a storm, and he will allow you to be still, know that he is God, and all your fear and anxiety will dissipate, even in the midst of the storm. So it's very important that we stress that last week. But remember what Mark is doing here in the Gospel of Mark, which is the reason we're studying Mark, is Mark teaches us how to be disciples. Mark is a very short gospel, and it gets right down to the nitty-gritty of action, activity. How are we to do these things? How are we to move forward? And so right on the end of that particular, not parable, but that scene where Jesus, that miracle where Jesus calms the sea, and they say, who is this? That even the sea begs at his command. And so right on the heels of that, we come into another situation where, remember before, though Jesus was calming the sea, the point is that you are here in the presence of the Savior. You're here in my presence, the one who created the sea, the one who is in charge of the storms. Be still. Know that I am your God. You know, it always reminds me, and at some point we're going to have to break from the Gospel of Mark and go through one of my favorite Psalms, Psalm 46, where it says, I, the Lord, am your refuge and your strength, a present help in the time of trouble. Therefore, we will not be afraid. And so we have to really remember that. When we think of a refuge, we think of a tower, we think of a building, we think of safety, we think of when there's war, this is the place where you go and no harm will come upon you. And Jesus, God says, I am that for you. I am your refuge. And so when we think about that, the refuge, the thing that is our refuge is the thing that has created the heavens and the earth. I mean, how cool is that? The person that is in charge of everything, that is on the throne, that controls everything, and nothing evil that happens can happen without his permission, is the one that says, I am that to you. I am your refuge. I am your safety. And so in that, there should be something in our little mind that says, what shall I fear? You know, and again, it's not necessarily removing the storm, but having the disciples recognize that you're here in my presence, in the midst of the storm, everything is going to be okay. And so now we move here into this man, this eerie kind of illustration that's given to us when you think about everything else in the Bible. You think about this man, and so let's talk about it a little bit. Where was he living? He was living in the tombs, along the lakeside, but in the higher parts of the mountains that were basically utilized as tombs, almost like a cemetery on the hill. And this is a place where it's dark and it's damp, and at nighttime you would fear to go there. You know how sometimes you go running through Arlington Cemetery during the middle of the day because it's so beautiful looking at the tombstones, but would you really want to be there or at any cemetery in the middle of the night? You start hearing all kinds of things besides the little critters and stuff. And so this is where this man dwelt. You know, in some places like that, in tombs and caves, you know, it's just like a bat that flatters his wings when you go into a cave because of any little piece of sunlight or daylight that gets there. So this man was dwelling in a place that was constantly dark and dreary. Think about that. He was dwelling in a place that was constantly dark and dreary. A place that there was loneliness. Nobody else was hanging out in these caves. This is where the dead people were. And so our environmental conditions have a lot to do with our state of mind. You know, who are you dwelling amongst? Are you dwelling amongst not just in a place where you are physically alone, but you can be in the midst of thousands of people who are dark people. They have bad energy, they have negative thoughts, they have negative dispositions, they have no creativity, they have no vision, no outlook in life. They're just here moving from day to day. And we're surrounded by so many of those people. But in your intricate circle, in Jesus' circle, there was James and John. Who's in your little circle that provides you light in the midst of this dark world that we're living in? So it's very important to keep that in mind as we move through this story. We're talking about an individual that was dwelling in environmental conditions that were dark and dreary and lonely. Think about that. Then, next he says that he was often binded and bound in chains which he kept breaking apart. He was literally cutting himself with glass. And you're in the middle of there somewhere. I said, how weird is that? And no one could tame him, and no one could bind him or allow him to stay bound like that, no matter how they chained him. And why were they chaining him? Was someone trying to rescue him from himself? Why would someone tame or try and tame someone that was out of control, that was living off somewhere by itself? You have to think in your sanctified imagination that this man had a family, because even in these times, nobody was like I'm single today. It's a whole different world today. But back then, every man had a wife or two, and 15 goats, cows, and horses and children too. You just weren't alone. So you have to think, how long has this man been living in these tombs? And that means the length of time that he was away from some family that, as the man, he should have been providing for. So maybe the brother-in-law, maybe the uncle, maybe, whatever male relatives went and said, yeah, let's go find John because we're tired of taking care of John's family and friends. So in trying to find John, they see he's in this mental state, and they're trying to tame his mental state. They're trying to put him back into a certain type of bondage, maybe to remove him from those environmental conditions. Is this sounding familiar? Because the story, every story in the Bible is written for us to translate it into today's time so that it can benefit us just how it benefited those of the past. And so often we see our family and friends that have just kind of lost their minds, and we are trying to do the rescue thing. We're trying to go and we're trying to remove them. First of all, that's the first thing that they tried to do, is to remove him from his environmental conditions, to get him out of that dark place, to get him away from those people hanging out in that condition, and bring him back to a place of familiarity, back to a place where folks are working and trying to make a living for themselves, etc., etc. And the only way that sometimes you can do that, because talking to young people now, talking to people that have gotten into these situations, is just like you're talking to a wall. So what you try to do is kind of put them and extract them at least from the environmental conditions first, so that you can get them into a place where they can actually hear what you're trying to say to them. So they tried to bind him, but he wasn't having it. He was breaking the chains, and he was doing a lot of damage to himself, cutting himself with glass and breaking the chains. He was doing a lot of damage to himself mentally, physically, emotionally. And that is what people will do when you try to grab them and pull them from suicidal conditions mentally that just are going to destroy their lives in that sense. That is what they're going to do. They're going to fight back. They're going to fight back. They're going to rather kill, hurt, and harm themselves than come along gently and go with you. And so it's important that we see this so that we recognize it, and we recognize that, what is the Bible? Basic instructions before leaving earth. This is our guidebook to how to handle things. And today I just hear it over and over again. We've got to get some mental health in here. We've got to get some mental health in here. Well, this man was about as mentally deranged as they come. And this is the solution. This is the guide that the Bible is giving us in terms of how to deal with the person who has been mentally deranged. And we look around us. It's not prejudice. It's in everybody's family, and it can happen to the best of us. The environmental conditions, the stress, the anxiety, the pandemic, it is making everybody crazy. And so, this is how the Bible is teaching us to deal with it. So, and then here's what's important too. Why did these people feel that they could move him and get him to change? Because at some point in time, this man knew God. And so that's the first thing when we're dealing with people, is to recognize, even if we can't save this particular generation, the importance of taking the next generation that's coming along and making sure that there's an introduction to God there. The thing that is going to save this man is the fact that there had been a previous relationship with God. How do I know there's been a previous relationship with God? Because it says that he saw Jesus from afar. How did he even know who Jesus was? The very people walking and in his circle didn't quite know who he was. Just 2 or 3 verses ago, they said, who is this that even the sea listens to him? And so here you have someone that recognized him from afar. And he went running to him. But here, you have to love this. You have to love the demon, that's in us. Because it says, he went and worshipped and knelt down to God. But at the same time, there were loud shrieks coming from him saying, God, what do you have to do with us, Son of Man? Don't torture us. Those are two people talking. And that's what happens to us in everyday life. We want to follow God. We want to be like God. But then that other thing inside of us is saying, you don't want to be like that. That's too hard. You're not going to have any fun following the rules of God. It's a constant battle. The enemy inside of you is trying to keep you from doing the will of God. That is why Jesus, one of the favorite verses is when Jesus said to Peter, the devil wants to sift you like wheat. And when he said to Peter, he's looking at Peter as a leader, but he's talking to all of us as disciples. When you decide in your mind that you're going to follow God, you have decided that you are going to put yourself in the battlefield, in the target zone of Satan himself. Because he doesn't care about people that are not doing the will of God. He cares about the person that's going to be obedient to God. He cares about the person that is focused on the will of God. And that's his enemy. And he is an enmity to God. And so that is what we have to be careful. And Jesus warned Peter about that. He warned Peter because Peter is going to be the rock. And he says, I am going to be praying for you, Peter. And so if Jesus needs to pray for us in a particular manner, we need to be aware that what happened to this man is happening to all of us on a daily basis. And we can get so far off track if we're not careful. And so the thing is that's going to save this man is that there was some common recognition. There was still a desire to do what? The first thing he did was to kneel down and worship Jesus. In the midst of these things, he calls himself Legion. So Jesus had already tried to heal the man. He had done it the same way that he had taken the demons out of the other people. Come out of them. Unclean spirit is what he said a couple of chapters ago. And the demon came out of the man. But in this particular case, after he says come out, it didn't work. We know it doesn't work because the Bible says so. He says, and he said to him, come out of the man. Then he asked. Then he's going to step number 2. Because step number 1 didn't work as it traditionally works. Sometimes some people just require a little bit of prayer. Sometimes a little bit of laying your hands on. Sometimes a little bit of counsel. But we don't give up when that doesn't turn them around. Jesus didn't give up on the man because he has a sympathetic heart for saving the soul, the lost soul. And so what did he do? He goes to step number 2. And back then, in the demon-possessed, everybody believed in demons back then. And they believed that if you could get a demon to admit his name, then you could take away his power. And so he says, what is your name? And so the man that is worshiping and kneeling to God no longer has enough power to override and tell him, my name is Dallas. But the demons inside of him say, our name is Legion. They're speaking, but yet the man is saying, my name is Legion. He's trying to say, my name is Dallas, but those demons inside of him take over, take control, and say, we're Legion. And why Legion? Legion back then, everybody knew, meant the Roman troops of 6,000 troops or so. He's saying 6,000 of them are in me and controlling me. 6,000. And then you have to think of the Roman troops that were back then. These were people that were brutal. It's just like some of these Russians that are over here in Ukraine right now. They were known for just no morals at all. And so you have to wonder, how did this man who has a family that is constantly trying to pull him from his state of delusion back to the real world, how did he ever get separated from them? Again, using your sanctified imagination. I'm just using mine because you just wonder, why would somebody want to be alone and out here cutting themselves on glass and shrieking in the middle of the night all the time? He probably saw something that drove him over the edge. And no doubt when they said we're a legion, maybe it was 6,000 troops. Maybe they came in and raped his daughter or whatever. But you have to think that it was something so brutal that it just crashed his mind. And that is another thing we're dealing with today when we start talking about mental health counselors. We're talking about 13 and 14-year-olds that are out here killing people like they're in the wild, wild west. So you're talking about 7 and 6-year-old children that are watching their older siblings shoot their parents, shoot their neighbors. This stuff is happening in the middle of households, in the middle of apartments. People are coming in and shooting mothers in the head with a gun. Just think of the mental torture that does when that child grows up. He's not going to be anything but a menace to society. Because something like that drives you crazy. And in this particular time, it probably drove this man so much out of his mind that at least he didn't want to be a harm and a danger to his loved ones. So he takes himself out into the tombs to live amongst the dead. And with all of this going on in his mind, we still see the light. And so whether you believe in demons, whether you believe that children that watch their parents get raped or get shot should or should not be able to deal with that, whatever you think is not important. It is what that individual is dealing with. And whether you believed in demons or not, this man was convinced that at least 6,000 of them were living in his head and making all of the decisions for him. And because our Savior is wise, because he is our healer, and he recognized that whether Jesus believed in demons or not, he knew that this man believed in demons, and this man was convinced that they had total control of his body. So Jesus did what he does to save us. He had to present this man with an undeniable resolution in his head that I am taking these demons out of you so that you can come back to your sanity. And the way that he had to do that was to transfer the illusion of them being in his head to the swine so that he could see the violent behavior of them that had been taking place in him exhibited on something else. And of course, we have those that say Jesus killed, 2,000 pigs here. Some people say, well, it was a Gentile country. Some people say, but Jews owned them and Jews had no business having any dealings with pork. You can say whatever you want to say, but at the end of the day, for the self-righteous people out here that are dealing with, we'll save a well, but we don't care about the children that don't have anything to eat. Jesus is not like that. Jesus obviously cares about every creature because he created every creature. But he's given man dominion over creatures, not to say that he doesn't care about creatures, but it's definitely to say that he is more concerned about the soul of a human being before that of an animal. And how hypocritical of those that talk about saving the animals, where basically, cows and pigs are brought up and raised to be killed. No one's saying that when they're eating pork chops and hamburgers, And so you look at this thing, and Jesus did what was necessary to make this man feel restored. And he could see it clearly, because the violence that was in his head, the thing that was speaking for him, was now in the swine. And the swine decided that we'd rather kill ourselves than have these folks up in us. And they ran violently down the hill and drowned into the sea. That's powerful there. That's where we're going to pick up in 2 weeks to talk about that. Because here we have a story of somebody that realizes that the demons are in their mind, taking control of their consciousness. Taking control, meaning that though they would want to go to the right, they're being forced to the left because they have no control over that thing inside of them. And so you and I need to recognize that there's two there. There's the one that wishes to do the will of God and the one that wishes not to do the will of God. And how are you going to subdue that one that wishes to go against the will of God? That has to come by crying out to Jesus. That has to come by kneeling down and worshiping him. That has to come by believing that he is able and he will and he wants to keep you sane. Before any health counselor, before any of that, we have the ultimate healer, and he's a wise healer. There's nothing new under the sun that we're dealing with, whether it's post-pandemic, whether it's the violentness that's going on, the video games, the accessibility to weapons. We still have the same God yesterday, today, and forever. And he is the one that can set you free and deliver you. And we must always stay focused on that. That's it. That's it. That's so much it. So think about that. Where are you allowing your mind to reside? What type of environmental conditions are you allowing your mind to deal with on a daily basis? Are they positive things? Are they things that are filled with light, or is it darkness? You know, it's funny that the word night, so it says that the demons back then would always come out at sundown and just before the crow croaks, that's what Jesus said, Peter, before the crow croaks 3 times, you will do X, Y, and Z, because that is when the demonic spirit, that is when it takes control at night. And isn't it interesting that we get the word luna, like the lunatic, you know, moonstruck, and whether you believe in any of that or not, you know, there's a lot of scientific data that says that, you know, the body acts differently during the moon right time. So, you know, so just, you know, it's important where we spend our time, the type of environments that we're in, and what kind of thoughts we allow our mind to even be on. You know, the Bible tells us, focus on those things that are pure, focus on those things that are holy. And so when we're constantly listening to the news and we're on the internet and we're just on these sites that are trending, the things that are trending, it says that we're in the world but we're not of the world. Chances are there's stuff that just, our eyes are just, it's no good. And instead, let us dwell on the Word of God. Let us make sure that we're reading the Bible on a daily basis. Let us make sure that we're spending quiet time with our Savior on a daily basis. And these are the things that are going to keep us well. These are the things that are going to protect our mind. So, today we're going to do a really simple dish. It's warm outside. It's the summertime. So we probably want to focus on foods that are going to be nice and easy. So I had some guests over the other day, and it was all about what can I prepare that's nice and cool. Not everybody's totally into raw food like we do, you know, the raw bread and everything. So here's a dish. I did 2 or 3 really nice dishes. We did carrot tuna. We did, for people that aren't, you know, they still want to eat meat. I always say, you know, if you introduce or, you know, you're vegan and you want to reintroduce meat back into your, just start with sardines. Sardines are a very small fish, so their digestive system is much smaller, so the contamination from the water is going to be much less. Same thing with anchovies, if you just, and you know, but a ton of protein that comes with it that is actually the protein that exists there because you're eating it basically in its raw state. You know, you don't have to cook sardines like you do with the other meat products that by the time you do all of that, the protein that's supposedly there is diminished. So this is a very easy dish. I just did some things ahead of time just to save time because I have like 10 minutes left. So again, when we're preparing anything, whether we want it to be light and cool or whatever, we want to make sure that we're getting a plethora of nutrients. And the way that we ensure that without getting crazy about things is to make sure that we have a variety of colors. So we have yellow, orange, and red peppers. Tons of vitamin C here. Excellent medicinal properties. Never throw the seeds away. They're very valuable in terms of healing. But in terms of color, we have red, we have orange. Orange foods orange foods are great for the skin. Yellow foods are natural laxatives. Red foods move the blood. We always use green stuff. So we have celery. Celery is predominantly sodium. Sodium does what? It takes care of the extracellular fluid in the body. Then we have parsley. You can use parsley and cilantro and basil, just a combination of herbs. We're going to make a walnut pate. So we have walnuts here. Why are we using walnut pate? I decided to do this because the walnut is what? It's the shape of the brain. And so when we talk about demonic spirits and people taking over your brain, why not feed our brain and strengthen it as much as we can? It's also the shape of the lungs, and it just so happens that walnuts are excellent for the lungs as well as the brain. So we just simply soak these overnight and let them drain out this morning. So that's, 2-3 cups of walnuts. These are your condiments to it, so they're about half of the size. No measurements here, just basically eyeball it. You've got twice as much of the main ingredient as you do your other things. We always want to go with a ton of our superfoods condiments is what I call them. So we're using sweet onions here just because for the guests, you know, they're not as familiar. So when I did the carrot tuna and the sardine salad, I brought a whole bunch of Vidalia onions, which are sweeter. I prefer red onions, but all onions will give you that sulfur that is really, really good for the entire healing of the mind and the body. We have fresh garlic that's been minced. We have a few jalapeno peppers and a good tablespoon or so of pink Himalayan salt. And that's all you need. And the thing that makes this so great is that all we have to do is put the walnuts into the food processor, just to grind it down. And then we're going to mix all those other ingredients together, throw in some olive oil, and we're going to be done. Now, depending on how accustomed you are to eating raw foods, what you could do is throw all of the ingredients into the food processor. And so I took that blade and put it on the high blade because I'm used to doing the carrot the carrot for the carrot bread. And a lot of times it turns into like a dough and it doesn't get the bottom of the mixture. Love live videos. We're going to have to put the blade back on the bottom so that it gets those nuts at the bottom chopped properly. That's just going to take a second here. Blow this back through. And for those of you who didn't know that we had the little popcorn snafu at the warehouse and we were doing $25 for a case to be sent to you, if you are in one of the local churches, chances are your pastor got several cases and they will be distributing them after service this coming Sunday. I will be over at Mount Lebanon preaching Sunday, but Mount Jezreel, Mount Pleasant, East Washington Heights, my home church, Allen AME, all the places I've spoken at this summer, they will all be giving popcorn, large bags, big giant 4-ounce bags, so that maybe you will skip the Golden Corral on your way home from church on Sunday and just snack on some True Pop, which will be really good for your mind. So we can either put this right in and it'll be really chunky, or we can run it through the blender and blend it down a little bit because it's looking really chunky. So I think I'm going to actually do that. How am I running on time here?
4:33.
Alright, good thing the airport is like 10 minutes from here and there's no real cleanup needed after this. So sometimes you just have to go with the flow. Typically I'm preparing a lot of food, and so I would have way more nuts. And so since I don't have that many nuts and I don't want them to be drowned out by all of the good stuff, I'm just going to throw everything in here except the sea salt and the peppers. Just grind it down a bit, just to get it a little thinner. And then I'll put the peppers on top so that they don't get too done. See how simple this is and how creative you can be. So quick story, the little town advisory group had the national level flower foundation people. So it was a couple of months ago that they asked if I could entertain them in my garden, since they're all about flowers and stuff. And we usually do that every summer. I'll make a brunch and serve it. And I'm coming home from the tennis court on Monday. And I was like, what am I supposed to be doing tomorrow? And so at 7:30 at night, I see on my calendar for the next day, 3 o'clock, town hall, guests from wherever. And so I had to get up the next morning, get the flowers all fancy for the deck, and clear things off, and put together food for 7 people. So use some olive oil. I'm going to throw the sea salt in. You start out with just a smaller amount of sea salt, and then at the end you can always add more of the sea salt and or the olive oil if you need to. And so I made some dishes very similar to this. I made some raw cheese, put some baby cucumbers and carrots all around the platter, and it was just fabulous. Gave me some black bean chips, because I didn't have any raw bread. And so this is it. This is one of my favorites. Call it walnut pate. And you can use any nut. You can use an almond. You just simply soak them and do the same thing. Almonds and walnuts are probably a little better than the pecans, cashews, and stuff. And then you can add what you want, whether it's a lot of celery or no celery. Definitely want peppers. And basically, I always put jalapeno peppers in just to give it a little hint. If you take jalapeno peppers, olive oil, and a little sea salt, and add that to any nut or vegetable combination, you're going to pretty much be in the ballpark. That's a 10-minute dish. That is such a 10-minute dish. So easy. So colorful. So pretty. You can do it with raw carrot bread. Spill that all over the place. Do it with raw carrot bread. You can go and buy, like I said, if people aren't totally there yet with the raw, even though most people love the raw carrot bread. You can simply do tortilla flats or chips or anything. And it's very sustainable. Almost never do you have to do any adjustments. So easy. So delightful. So delightful. And then on a hot day, on a hot day like this, that's what you need. A nice cool dish. And come back from flying, all I have to do is rinse that stuff out. And this is enough that will last. You can stuff a pita bread with it. A cabbage leaf, anything that you want to do. So economical, so quick, so easy, so fabulous tasting. And that's what I call transitioning from nothing to something. Transitioning from a maniac mind to a sane mind. That is what God can do for us. Have a wonderful evening. I'll see you in 2 weeks.